Thank you so much, Chris, and I'm excited to introduce Jeff Selingo. It is my pleasure to introduce the New York Times bestselling author of 3 books on education and the job market. For nearly 25 years, his in-depth reporting and powerful storytelling has provided practical insight into the future of higher education and the workforce for university leaders, corporate executives, as well as students and parents. He writes regularly for the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Jeff is a professor and special advisor for innovation at the Arizona State University. He also writes, he appreciates that humor. He also writes a bi-weekly newsletter on all things higher ed called Nest and co-hosts the podcast Future You. His latest book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, was published in September of 2020 and named among the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. And today, we are delighted that Jeff has joined us for a conversation about his findings and experiences as it relates to the world of admissions. Welcome, Jeff Selingo.
Well, you should call me the Jeff Selingo.
The Jeff Selingo. I just had an article in there.
With a little TM after it.
Who doesn't love a good article? I love a good article, right? It means it's fancy and good. So I want to get into the book. Actually, for anyone who has not, please, I recommend this read.
I'm sorry. Yep.
But what's awesome about this book, what I have in front of me, for those of you who are interested, I've broken down the book in my assessment in 2 ways. Jeff provides a wonderful statistics for us as educational leaders to reference, but then just really rich some quantitative and qualitative analysis of a variety of institutions. But Jeff, I have to ask, not everyone has had the opportunity yet to read this publication. Why did you want to do this, and go in this immersive fashion? And, what were some of the key questions that you were hoping to answer? And were the key questions you did answer the ones you started off trying to answer?
Great question. So I decided to do this book a couple of years ago. I reread Fast Food Nation, which many people might have read on this thing, right? So Fast Food Nation was fascinating to me because it took you inside an industry by looking at the various players in it, right? The history of Carl's Jr. It took you inside a meatpacking plant, on a potato farm, right? And it took you a deep dive into each portion of that industry. And as I was reading that book, I thought in many ways higher education, but particularly admissions, was ripe to be told in the same way. Because that same summer, I reread Jack Steinberg's book, The Gatekeepers, which I think for many admissions professionals is kind of the book around, an inside look at college admissions. But that was almost 20 years old at the time. It was around 2000. And as we all know, admissions has changed drastically. So that was really the impetus for the book, is to look at the admissions industry as a whole, but also not just go inside one institution. I ended up, as you know, and many people who read the book know, I ended up inside 3 admissions offices at Emory, at Davidson, and at the University of Washington. But I also wanted to look at all the various players in the admissions ecosystem. So I also looked obviously at students and followed students, seniors who were applying everywhere. But one thing that Jack didn't do, because I don't think it was as big as it is today, but when you go into that hall at NACAC and you see all the players, including Capture, higher ed, which is in the book, of course, all the players that are pulling levers in the background that students and parents particularly don't really know exist. And what are they doing? Because the goal of this book, and I'm not sure that the college folks today would appreciate this necessarily, is that I wanted to make students and parents better consumers. This is going to be one of the biggest price tag items that they're going to buy in their life after a home and a car, most likely. And I just think that parents and students are not great consumers of higher ed. So that's the question that I went into, is how can we kind of pull back the curtain to make them better consumers? And one of the things that I guess didn't surprise me, but surprised me to the level that it was, that I saw, was about how college admissions, because I'd worked for the Chronicle, I'd covered higher education for more than 25 years. So I kind of knew this, but maybe not to the level, and I guess I didn't really explain it to people out there as much as I could have over those 25 years, is how much college admissions is really around kind of the institutional priorities and not around the applicant. And again, and I think that once parents and students understand that, because I think most people, I'm a Gen Xer, I think most Gen Xers now who have kids going to college or about to go into the college search, they really have an emotional tie to their institution. But we all know that admissions is much different today than it was in the 80s and early 90s. And I think that emotional tie has to now be supplemented by a much harder look at the financial returns on higher education and really approaching this as a consumer.
I think also something else that you mentioned a little bit later in the book, that you said admissions is also based on the potential of the student and not just what they accomplished, prior to entering that institution. I thought that was really an important concept that some people forget.
Yeah, I mean, we're really looking ahead. This is 18 years, right? And most institutions, I think, are looking for a mindset in a student. Are they going to come to campus, and are they just going to basically be a spectator to their education? Are they just, going to kind of go to classes, participate maybe in some activities, but not really stretch themselves in the ways that I think college is really meant to be? College is really meant for you to kind of interrogate your beliefs and your ideas and what you want to do when you get there at the age of 18. It's really the only time in life that you have the freedom to do that at a point when you're really maturing. And what's interesting to me about admissions, though, is much of the assets that a student is sending to an institution within an application is not about potential. It's about the past. It's all about what I did in high school, what I've done in high school. And in some ways, it's baked well before high school. The thing that really kind of maybe surprised me a little bit in sitting in those admissions offices for that year was just how much the high school transcript counts toward eventual admission. And just think about the transcript. Think about, 4 years, or at that point, maybe 3+ years of grades, the courses you took freshman and sophomore year, as we all well know, are baked well before freshman year. A lot of it's what you take in 8th grade or 7th grade to set up for that freshman and sophomore year. So here we are judging these students on the past, when a lot of this is, what are they going to bring to our campuses?
I think before I get into some of the questions as relates to how does it relate to admissions professionals and things, maybe some insight you can give to our audience. As you know, the majority of our audience today are marketing and enrollment leaders. But you break in the book, you discuss there are sellers and buyer institution types. And I think that's a really important concept for our audience to understand, as most schools in our nation will fall into
buyers.
Into the buyer category. And so can you just kind of explain that concept to our audience?
Right. So all of us here understand the idea of enrollment management and tuition discounting and kind of how we build a class. But for most people on the other side of the desk, students and parents, they don't quite get this. And again, remember, Gen Xers, a lot of those students came of age when, a lot of financial aid was based solely on financial need. Although obviously even in the 80s, it was enrollment management and tuition discounting and leveraging was even increasing then. And I really wanted to explain to parents and students that this is not just about academic fit and social fit. We so often talk about fit in college, but it's also about financial fit. And financial fit doesn't come in at the end when you get that financial aid offer, but it really comes into where you're applying to. And one of the things that I saw in reporting the book is so often I would see students who were, shooting for the moon in terms of where to apply. And they would possibly get in, not all the time, but they would possibly get in. But they would get in, and then they wouldn't get necessarily the financial aid they were expecting, because maybe they were just above the financial aid cutoff for some of these institutions. Again, more selective institutions. And I wanted to try to explain to them, well, those were mostly what I call seller institutions, very small group of them, meaning that they have something to sell. They have this brand name. They have more applicants than they know what to do with. Kind of they're selling access to this kind of walled garden in higher education. But the vast majority of institutions, when it comes to admissions, are buyers. In other words, that they do have to discount tuition in a way to get students in the door. And I wanted to explain it in this way and have this bifurcation between buyers and sellers. Now, again, some people might be offended by those terms. It was not meant to talk anything about the type of education. In fact, as I point out several times in the book, you can actually get a really good education at buyers. In fact, the majority of institutions are buyers. Many of them are really good schools, and in some cases, I would even argue some better than seller schools. But I wanted for parents and students to really understand this world between buyers and sellers, especially when it came to the admissions process.
I mean, I think one of your examples you use is a young lady out in California where I believe she was accepted into one of the Ivies, but then eventually decides to go to, I believe it was UCLA or UC Berkeley.
Yeah, she ended up going to UCLA because she was an in-state student. Yeah. She was accepted at Wellesley, yes. But because middle income, I think her father was a firefighter, mother a teacher, just kind of was a little bit above the income cutoffs for a lot of the financial aid at Wellesley, and she just didn't get a lot as a result. Now, if she had applied to more buyer schools, which she didn't, she probably would have gotten a decent amount of merit aid at some of these schools, but she didn't do that. She ended up at UCLA, which of course is not an issue at all, I think, but she clearly wanted to go to a private college on the East Coast, and it didn't work out for her.
You know, the theme of our conference, as I shared with you, is Find Your Balance. And in your book's introduction, you acknowledge the following. What I hope to do in this book is show that college admissions is a business. It is a big one that you have very little control over. Can you share what you determined to be the main cause of stress amongst higher ed recruitment and marketing professionals now that you've had the opportunity to be ingrained with them, for almost a year? And how do you see the future of this profession? And what changes do you foresee?
At the end of the day, there's just too much friction in the system. And the system is really driven by these more selective institutions, which, as we know, even over the last 2 years, have been inundated with more and more applications. And so we really have a two-tiered system in admissions where we have the largest publics and privates, the more selective publics and privates kind of driving the system, meaning they're the ones who say to the Common App, we want all of these assets, right? We want these grades with transcripts and recommendations and multiple essays and things like that. When for most institutions to make an admissions decision, they don't really need that much. Most institutions don't. And so where I think the cause of stress to me is not only, finding potential students to fill the top of your funnel, but really reducing the friction that they have in learning whether they could get in and how much it's going to cost. And because so much of our narrative around college is, it's so hard to get in, when we know it isn't, right? The average acceptance rate of American colleges and universities is something like 62%. But we know that the media, and I'll take a little blame for this, is really driven by the narrative of these selective schools where it is hard to get in. And so most parents and students believe it is hard to get in. And what you pay for college is kind of a black box. So if we could reduce the friction on those two things very early on, and this is why I'm really excited about all the experiments going on now around this idea of direct admissions, so that we just reduce that friction so that when we find a student we want, we bring them into our fold immediately. We get what we need out of them in terms of the data to determine whether they're going to succeed here. But I will again argue that we ask for way too much to determine that. Get them into the fold, get them accepted, get them their financial aid offer, and then they're assured they have a spot somewhere. And that really changes their perspective on higher education and that institution in particular. The faster you could do that, the easier you could do that and reduce that friction for students and parents early on so that they're assured they have a spot somewhere and it's not going to cost them an arm and a leg, then I think, to me, that would reduce the stress on both the students, but more important on the institutions.
Speaking about friction, you talk about playing the odds, and, admissions is a mix of art and science. And we hear about this and the role the scoring plays. Emory used 4 variables, right? U of Washington uses 3 variables. And so as an outsider, what is your view or impression of the balance between the arts and the science? I mean, just talked about friction. And do you see the scale as our society is changing and how students and parents are viewing, the value of an education? Do you view it tipping one way or the other? And if so, which way? Because I'm sure some of our enrollment professionals are like, hey, maybe we need to be ahead of this.
Oh, it's a very good question. I actually think that I'm not quite sure it's tipping one way or the other. It's a nice mix. But from leadership, I think it's much more tipping towards the science. I think, the stuff that you're talking about with analytics, just the deeper amount of data now that we have on students and their engagement and that we know about students, the deeper amount of data that we know about students who come from certain high schools and how they perform at our institution so that we could then go out and get more of those types of students, right? So that's the science part of it. The art part of it, though, is when we do have way too many applicants that look similarly, it is a lot of judgment at that point, judgment on the part of the admissions office. So I think at the less selective institutions, I think science is really taking over. I see data playing a much bigger role in helping institutions fulfill their institutional needs for admissions going forward. At the more selective institutions, I still see it as a mix of science and art, because I think the art comes in when we're talking about we have way many more applicants than we have seats for these students.
At one point, you talk about the selling of the institution and the importance of selling the institution and the transformation an enrollment counselor begins to make. What recommendation do you have for enrollment professionals to balance talking about the mission, but the necessity of salesmanship? And they're equally important roles, but for many of the buyer institutions, they are tuition dependent institutions, the majority of them. There are some that, can rely on their endowment. So what advice would you give to that counselor, to the associate director of admissions?
I think that we have to start to embrace this role, that we are in a sales role. And what I fear on college campuses, as you know, if I walked onto a college campus and spoke to faculty and used the word business, use the word customer, use the word, student experience, if I used any of those words, people would walk out, they would throw things at me, right? And so I think that impacts then everybody else on campus, in that we speak in whispers, right? So I did a dinner with some VPs for enrollment a couple of weeks ago in New York, and it felt like they were freed to talk the way they really wanted to talk, because on campus they have to talk about some of this stuff in whispers because they're afraid of how the reaction to the faculty. I think, and we know this in the business world, in every other sector, you could be mission driven, but also a business. I mean, every business out there, even for-profit businesses, have missions. So there's nothing that is in opposition to each other to be a mission-driven institution that also has a bottom line, because that's what it is at the end of the day. And in admissions, you are that bottom line, right? That you have to deliver, because most of these institutions are tuition-driven. You have to deliver those students. And so one of the things I wish that admissions professionals would do is embrace that role even more, that we want to be customer centric, that we want to provide the amount of data that will help students make decisions about whether to come here, right? And not run away from it. I feel like we're running away from it so often because we're afraid of what the faculty will think. Well, to be honest with you, if it weren't for you, faculty wouldn't have a job because they wouldn't have any students sitting in their classroom.
Before I get to some of the questions in the comments, I do have another question. There is a student in the book, Chris. Chris is in rural Pennsylvania. But there's a stat that you provide us in the book a little early, midway through. 18% of the high schools provide 75% of the applicants, of which it becomes 79% of the admitted students.
Yeah.
Chris comes from a forgotten, potentially, high school. Maybe I'm describing it correctly, a rural high school in Pennsylvania. Do you believe, since the pandemic, that there's going to be less Chris's that are forgotten about because of enrollment technologies, that these students are going to become more discoverable? Or do you believe actually it's going to go the other way? The enrollment technologies are going to only make this 18% of high school students that much more accelerated and, bigger.
I actually think it might go the other way, where Chris's might be forgotten, because you want to know how Chris was discovered? His SAT score.
Mm-hmm.
And if it weren't for his SAT score, none of these colleges would care about him. And now, obviously, in a test optional world, Chris can still take the test. But he goes to a high school where the college counselor, not even a college counselor, it's truly a guidance counselor, who is overwhelmed. Most of the students don't go to college. So what's Chris's message? Testing is not required. He's not probably ever going to talk to his counselor about it, and thus won't take the test and won't be discovered as a result, because as Chris told me and other people at that school told me, he was more likely to have a military recruiter show up at his high school than a college recruiter. So no, I don't think the Chris's of the world are going to be found without some sort of national standard to find them, because Chris's school had only a couple of APs, again, small, rural, didn't send a lot of kids to college. Unless we have the technologies to find students like that, who are those true diamonds in the rough, I fear that in a test optional world, again, not that students are not going to take the test, but the Chris's of the world, I think, are more likely not to take the test because they're not going to get the message that it could potentially help them.
Selfishly, for Capture, as we try to engage with anonymous, students, that's only based upon their access to channels, right? Media channels, web channels, whatever that channel is. In your research, did you find that the Chris's sometimes also lack the access to the channels where, the schools that are able to identify those anonymous students because they're on the web, they're on TikTok, they're on Facebook, right? Those channels, that also these students are also on less of those channels?
Yeah, they're definitely on fewer of those channels because, as you remember, Chris, compared to the other two students who were in the book, I end up profiling 3 students, followed many more, but profiled 3 of them, is that he started the search much later, much less engaged in it, was really focused on maybe playing football because it was really his football coach that encouraged him to go to college. But the football coach didn't really do much else beyond, say, go to college, right? Was really influenced by older friends and where they went, if they went at all. So it was really kind of hit and miss. It was not a sustained effort, and it was an effort that started really late in the process. And so I fear that without the right messages, and Chris was helped greatly by, he was at a school with a college advising corps member. So college advising corps placing these recent college graduates in high schools to work as near peers and alongside the existing counselor. He was really helped by that person, that woman who graduated from F&M like 2 years earlier. And by the way, grew up in a very similar environment to Chris in rural Pennsylvania. One of the reasons why she wanted to go into the college advising corps. But that is, again, a very few number of high schools across the U.S. So it's something I do really worry about because these students exist. They exist everywhere. 25,000 high schools. The fact that an Emory, for example, might only be getting applications from, 5,000 or 6,000 high schools out of 25,000 tell you that there's a lot more students out there. The question is, how do we find them? How do we connect with them?
Before I provide you some questions from the field, I got to know, in the book, I think it ends with Chris's first semester. So we don't know if Chris persists at Gettysburg. For those of you who don't know, I'm a Civil War buff. So does he persist at Gettysburg?
No, he unfortunately doesn't. He has ended up transferring out of Gettysburg to a community college. A liberal arts college probably wasn't the right fit for him, or he didn't really understand what a liberal arts college really was. If you remember, he wanted to major in computer science, and wasn't really prepared for kind of the core curriculum that is kind of served up at a liberal arts college in the beginning. He also really wasn't prepared for the level of work at Gettysburg, particularly when it came to computer science. So he ended up transferring. It was also obviously impacted. All of these students were impacted by the pandemic, but he unfortunately did not. I guess depending on he's doing very well now. I haven't caught up with him in about 8 months or so, but the last time I caught up with him, he was doing very well, but didn't persist there at that 4-year college.
Thank you for sharing. I want to read a question from the field. Where do you believe schools should draw the line when recognizing that their school may not be the fit for a prospective student, but the student is still interested in attending?
It's a great question, right? Because you're trying to balance the fact that that they're not a great fit, but that the student is still interested. My feeling is that you have to be upfront to these students in the admissions process, whether that is there's too much of a gap, for example, in their financial aid package, and they're just going to struggle financially to stay there. They're just not a good social fit or academic fit. These are the students that a year or two later are going to be the most likely to not persist, right? To leave, and that's going to then impact your retention rate and eventually your graduation rate. So I get the fact that you need to make a class, and that the student is really interested, but I think it really is incumbent on the institution to try. I know you may not always succeed in telling students that this may not be the best place for them, but I think it is incumbent on the institutions to try, because even from an institutional perspective, it will eventually, I believe, impact your retention and graduation rates.
You also received another question. How do you see the concept of customer service being incorporated into enrollment management moving forward? In other words, can higher education truly ingrain quality customer service into the mix?
I believe it can if the proper investments are made. I mean, this digital transformation that has happened in every other sector of the economy that has allowed for much more customized and frequent interactions with students, or in this case, in other sectors of the economy, with customers, right? Every major retailer and other companies from Amazon to Netflix Apple understand, right? They're sending me notifications on my watch. They're constantly engaging with me, which then makes me a more dedicated customer. We know this technology exists. I think higher ed is just 5 or 10 years behind on it. And we're increasingly seeing this, right, with chatbots and other things to allow these more frequent and customized interactions. The problem is twofold. It requires higher digital IQ than I think many admissions offices and many institutions are prepared for. And I think it's even worse during the pandemic, where we see talent both in the admissions office and in the IT departments leaving. And it requires sustained investments that I think many institutions, without the margins that they need to make those investments, are not making right now. So that's where I worry that whether higher education can truly ingrain customer service into the mix. The service exists out there. It exists in other sectors of the economy. I think the problem is bringing it into higher
ed. 2 more questions. They'll be brief, as I know we're coming up on time. As you see the role of technology services, technology and services being incorporated into enrollment management, into admissions, what is the appropriate mix? As you see just this hardship that schools are facing, and, all the things that they're trying to balance by engaging with prospective students, by having these technologies, whether it's technologies like Capture, we heard from Campus ESP, Campus Reels, there's just a lot of different technologies. Any guidance that you can give on for institutional leaders on creating a better balance based upon what you were able to observe?
A better balance in terms of what they
use in their portfolio, right? To execute their institutional priorities.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is really understanding where that return on investment is, right? We have invested in a lot of technology and a lot of efforts on college campuses over the years that, to be perfectly blunt, have not paid off, but we continue to do it and use them, right? And I think it's kind of a continual look at what's possible. I also think that we're trying to bite off way too much in the beginning on so many things, right? I understand. I sit on a board of trustees myself. I actually chair the enrollment and marketing committee, and there is a lot of pressure from institutional leadership, meaning the board in particularly, to kind of fix these things. And I think that we're all impatient. We all want it to happen tomorrow. And so I think that really thinking about admissions as, okay, we're going to do this year. We're going to buy these products this year, see what impact that has, see what return that has, then look at the next year. And I understand everyone's under pressure, especially with the enrollment declines coming and things like that. But if we try to do it all at once, I think we're going to misspend in many ways. And we're really not going to know what pays off because we're not going to be really able to understand the data.
And lastly, you bring something up. So at the end of your book, you acknowledge your gratitude to your fellow board members and your alma mater, Ithaca College. How has this book changed you as a board member?
A great question. I really try to bring the perspective, not only of my expertise in higher ed, which is why I was asked to be on the board, but increasingly the perspective of the consumer and of the student, right? Most board members come to it because they've had children who went through the college search process, or in some cases grandchildren, right? So they have that perspective. But what I do is I try to widen their lens on trying to understand what the average consumer now is facing when they think about the college search. So that's hopefully the value that I'm bringing to the board.
Jeff, I know we've come on our time. We've gone a little over. On behalf of the entire Capture community, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It was great to be here. Thank you so much. We could have gone on for another hour.
We go to everyone out there, please. I recommend this phenomenal read. And thank you again, Jeff.
Thank you.